Отже, дорогі колеги, вітаємо всіх
Dear
сьогодні
colleagues,
на нашому семінарі подолання.
good morning, everyone, at the next in our series of overcoming the past seminar. This series is continuing the work of the section, overcoming the past section, which used to function on the website of the Ukraina Moderna magazine, and the section that was dedicated to totalitarian violence and the history of genocide. This is extremely relevant today, extremely pertinent today, and we decided to continue this section in a somewhat different format as seminars with scholars of the Second World War, of the 20th century, and the period of totalitarianism. I would probably like to start the seminar by giving the floor to the founding editor of Ukraina Moderna and the renowned Ukrainian historian, Yaroslav Vitsak. Yaroslav, the floor is yours. Thank you. I want to myself introduce an extremely famous Polish historian, Professor Dariusz Stola. A lot can be said about him, and I'm sure many of the guests have heard of him. I doubt that there is a historian in our space who has not heard of him at least once. I will probably reiterate only a few things by saying that Dariusz is a very important person to me. Professor Stola is a very important person to me because he represents this good old liberal Polish historiography that blossomed at the end of the PRL period, Polish People's Republic, and is now continued. Professor Stola wrote his dissertation under Marcin Król, and as a representative of this sort of liberal stream in the Polish historiography, I consider it perhaps one of the best historiographers in our region. But as a representative of that historiography, he's particularly sensitive to questions of national minorities, other ethnicities, and his second dissertation was dedicated to the anti-Semitism in the post-communist Poland. But I've neglected to say that Professor Stola mostly specializes in the communist period of the history of Poland, but he specializes in the Polish-Jewish relationship, the anti-Semitism, Jewish emigration from Poland, and so deservedly and logically, he was the director of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews until 2019. I think that was probably the best in the existence of that museum. I can still consider that museum as probably one of the best that that exists in our region. I'm very happy that Professor Stola has agreed to join us in our seminar, for which I'm very grateful. The floor is yours. Thank you. As Yaroslav has started the presentation of our speaker today, this is a famous Polish historian and professor at the Institute for Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Professor Stola specializes in the study of the history of the Holocaust, Polish-Jewish relationships, Polish-Jewish relations, the history of the post-war communist regime in Poland, and has co-authored or authored 7 books and academic work. Our seminar today is an extension of the Overcoming the Past section, but in the format of an interview. We now offer all of the participants the opportunity to hear our conversation or our interview over the past hour or so, over the next hour or so, after which you have the opportunity to ask questions, which I will ask you to please put in the chat. In the collective chat, you can note your questions that arise. And of course, we cannot guarantee that we will look at every question if there are many. So please we ask for your understanding, but we will also have a discussion at the end of today's interview. Without further ado, because our seminar today is a continuation of Overcoming the Past, my first question to Professor Stola has to do with the title of the rubric itself, Overcoming the Past. This formulation, which in Ukraine and abroad causes many discussions, particularly in the Ukrainian intellectual space. We hear a lot of these discussions proceeding either from a lack of understanding of the point of this category, or perhaps a denial or contesting of the meaning Could you tell us, in your opinion, does this concept is this concept legitimate, the concept of overcoming the past?
Well, first, wybaczcie, że ja nie rozmawiаю z wami ukraińską mową. I will speak English because my Ukrainian is too rudimentary. You know, I can buy a ticket for a bus in Lviv, but I cannot explain complex matters in Ukrainian. So second, I'm really grateful for the invitation to this seminar, and I admire this intellectual effort during the war. That means the war has not stopped you from continuing your efforts as historians, and I really greatly appreciate it. I greatly appreciate the resistance the Ukrainian army has offered to the Russian invasion. And in fact, Ukrainian army is defending Poland as well, not only Ukraine, but also Poland. This is how I understand this effort, that this is not just a war of Russia against Ukraine. It's, as Putin has declared, a war against the West. So in this sense, Ukrainian soldiers are defending all of us. And now going back to your questions, I have mixed feelings about the overcoming the past, because it means the past is a problem. I think the past is the problem when we make it a problem. I would rather see it how to convert the apparent problems with the past into assets, how we can find out that the past is a treasure for us. It's a treasure also when it's a dramatic past, full of blood and misery and suffering and destruction, because then it brings experience which can serve us today. So in this sense, I try to find out other words when I speak in Polish or in English, things like coming to terms, how we can come to terms with the past. The past is given, and in fact, as long as it's a shared past, is a basis for certain unity. We share a past. As nations, as historians, as Europeans, as East Europeans. I think the past is an asset, and thinking about it in terms of a problem shows that we have a problem of interpretation. In fact, this is much more about the memory of the past than the past, and about a particular way of looking at the past, which is, it may be painful, and it's sometimes painful for good reasons, because the past was traumatic at many moments. And I think we will come back to this, especially with the experience of the German occupation during the Second World War, when the killing rate, the amount of suffering imposed on civilians was the most intensive in European history, probably. So I would overcome the past by using a different word for this effort, like coming to terms.
Дякую вам за таку несподівану і цікаву інтерпретацію.
Thank you for this interpretation of this controversial concept in Ukraine. My next question would have to do with the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. Some historians believe that Ukraine is still a hostage of its historically non-beneficial status of the borderland of European civilization, the collision zone with Russia. How should we rethink or understand or come to terms with this past, considering this borderline situation? What recommendations would you give in this context?
Well, I would first think that you are not alone, that a lot of people believe they are in this border situation, that they are antemurale of something. And it seems that the number of countries that perceive themselves as border countries is growing in Europe. Spaniards and Italians and Greeks, certainly, and Bulgarians by all means, and Romanians as well, and Croats and Serbs, of course, and Bosniaks, and Poles and Ukrainians, and Estonians, Latvians, and Finns. Only the Germans have mixed feelings about speaking this way, because they have a bad past. They have a difficult past when they believe themselves to be the defenders of the European civilization. So otherwise, the club of the borderland countries has been rather growing than decreasing. This is one. Second, I remember very well these arguments from the 1980s when the Soviet domination was perceived as maybe not eternal, but a very long-term determinant. That's something we cannot change. So my formative experience as a young man in the 1980s, and I was involved in some underground publication projects, was that something that seemed inevitable, historically determined, was not. Adam Michnik used to say that there are two ways Soviet army will leave Poland. One is miraculous and the other is ordinary. So ordinary will be when the angel Michael will come with the sword of fire and throw the Soviet army away. And the miraculous will be when they pack and go. So a miracle happened, which shows that we are not determined, or we are only marginally determined. There are some things that are deterministic, but there are plenty of things that are not. And here again, we come to the effort of historians and people whose job is to think in general, is about interpreting the structural conditions we live in a way to find opportunities and minimize the risks. Of course, when you're attacked by your neighbor, interpretation doesn't give you much room in reaction, but still I think it's always good to try to think about this situation from more than one perspective. And because this language of being the border of something, especially a defensive border, it appears in many European countries. We can compare the ideas about it. And what is interesting, that they are defensive. They are built in the language of defense against an external threat. In case of Ukraine, this is a very visible threat, which has materialized. It makes it different to, let's say, the Polish or the Spanish or the Greek way of thinking about it. But still, I think it's a duty and it's an opportunity to compare it to others and find out what others have done with a similar situation in the past.
Дякую вам дуже за ці.
Thank you very much for these very valuable approaches and thoughts. In answering this question, you have touched on the role of historians. And then my next question actually pertains to what should historians be doing in the conditions of Russian aggression? There's the concept that historians are not very good analysts of contemporary events, much less forecasts of the future. Probably nobody is much good at forecasting in the future. But what should be the role of historians in conditions of Russian aggression today?
It's both a philosophical or meta-historical question and a very practical one. And again, I think historically, and I think immediately about the Polish historians who during the Second World War were involved in conspiracy. And a number of outstanding historians like Professor Manteuffel or Professor Kieniewicz, the leading Polish historian of the 19th century, they were part of the Polish Home Army intelligence operations. They worked in the Bureau of Propaganda and Information of the Home Army in Poland. And after the war, they became the leading historians. So I do not agree that historians are not good at analyzing contemporary events, because our profession helps us develop analytical skills. And I don't like predictions. I don't like making predictions about the future, but this means that we have greater awareness than others to what extent the future is unpredictable. So I think historians may be very good at criticizing predictions of others, predictions of people who are too fast in making predictions. And so we know something about the past, that the past and the future, which is that the future is not easily predictable, that it's very easy to make mistakes about the future. And this is a knowledge. It's a negative knowledge, but still it's useful when you have to make decisions about how do you see the future. Let me make a distinction between predictions, forecasts, and hope. Hope is a virtue. And again, going back to the 1980s, my personal formative period, is that the predictions for the future were bad. Soviet Union will last, communist rule in Poland will last. But I remember very well this strange feeling of hope, which was against predictions. And hope is a virtue in a sense like courage is a virtue. You can practice it. It's not just ability to see something optimistic in the future. I would say the opposite. Hope does not contradict realistic visions of the future. So historians have skills in analyzing the present and in properly judging predictions for the future. But when you think about what role historians can make in times of war, and you mentioned propaganda, and I have mentioned intelligence. I believe intelligence, the way of thinking, analytical work is more important. I also know about historians who have been involved in propaganda efforts. I remember when I was researching in the British archives many years ago, I found some name of outstanding British historians working for the British war effort. But I am afraid there is a cost for this. Namely, working for propaganda, which at times and quite often is misleading, is partial, overemphasizes success and underemphasizes the losses, for example, may have a cost of affecting our ability to judge properly information. So yes, we can make it, but we must be aware of the very likely cost it may affect our ability. So it's not completely neutral. We are becoming what we do. So if we systematically think in terms of the efficiency of communication, how we can influence people, we may lose the ability to distinguish the true from the untrue, true and false, which is the major job we have. Distinguishing, I think this is the 11th commandment of historians, distinguish. So yes, if necessary, but remember that you may pay a price for it.
Дякую вам за цю відповідь.
Thank you for this answer to the role of historian and the question that is very vibrant in Ukrainian audience today, the Ukrainian discourse today, the question of propaganda and counter-propaganda. My next question brings us all the closer as to how we think of the events of the Second World War. Again, this is to remind the listeners, Professor Stola has studied these events. He has studied their interpretation in the present day. And as of today, we see in the Ukrainian information field, we see the long shadow of the Second World War. On the one hand, Russia uses Soviet-era myths of this war in its anti-Ukrainian propaganda. On the other hand, we see the power of the discourse of the Second World War in the media in Ukraine. We often hear this from the people in the media. We hear expressions like worse than the Germans, fascists, Nazis, etc., and the recent fascisti, often used in Ukrainian discourse to describe the actions of the aggressor. What might this discourse be indicative of? And how legitimate is the use of the concept of of the events, from the events of the Second World War, a different war that still, whose discourse still continues to exist in our information sphere.
So I realized that history is important for several matters. The past is important for several matters. When Putin, it's already almost 2 years ago, he made a speech, actually a long lecture on history of Poland 2 years ago, a little bit less than 2 years ago, for a Euro-Asian association. And first, I was shocked that a head of a big state devotes 40 minutes of his talk to a lecture on a history of a medium-sized European country, and spend some time thinking about it. And then later events, and both I mean the Russian propaganda and also the propaganda of Polish government under the populist party, under the party of Mr. Kaczyński, it first shows that the abuse of history, the deliberate and systematic misrepresentation of the past, we should treat as an early warning mechanism, because people who systematically misrepresent the past do it for a purpose. Memory policy is not a policy for itself, it's to justify other policies. So when people systematically distort the past, we may expect something worse than just distorting the past. So first, when you see it, beware. When you see such things, it's a sign of worse things to happen. Second is that Second World War is a shared history for many people. I don't know how does it look in Asia, although when I was in China, that it was also an important topic, but certainly in Europe, Second World War is the catastrophic event that many people share. And some of its parts, so for example, the Holocaust became a part of the popular culture of the West in the last 30 years. It wasn't the case, let's say, in the 60s, but it became, so we have a shared topic which makes it a point of reference in many of the discussions. So sometimes it's ridiculous. You have this reductio ad Hitlerum, that after some minutes of hot controversy, people eventually come to the moment of comparing someone to Hitler. So of course it's stupid. It doesn't clarify anything. It's a way of just hitting your opponent. But this is the abuse of the past or the misuse of the past. But still, as I said at the beginning, the past is an asset, is a resource we can use. But then we must stick to some basic principles of our profession, which is don't say what you know is untrue. We may be wrong, but we shouldn't be lying. So the difference is in intention. We make mistakes, all of us. When I read my articles written many years ago, I see my own mistakes, which I believed very much at the time of writing. But I try not to deliberately mislead my readers. And when I see someone else deliberately misleading the audience, as I saw Vladimir Putin doing in his historical speeches, I know that something really bad is in the making. And here, let me go to the Polish government. I was trying to understand why memory policy is so important for the populist party in Poland. And I have a working hypothesis. I haven't tested it yet, but maybe some of you may test it. That populism is a fragmentary ideology or thin ideology. It requires other ideologies to parasitically exploit them, like nationalism, for example. And I see that with the decline of the great ideologies of the 20th century, like liberalism, conservatism, fascism, communism, there is a certain void, and memory policy may be a substitute for ideology. It may serve certain functions, especially the function of mobilizing support. It's strongly motivational, especially when it uses a past which still evokes strong emotions. And Second World War evokes very strong emotions because of the amount of suffering it has imposed. There are many studies how it may be transmitted across generations. And I think this is really interesting, how the generation which really personally remembered the Second World War transmitted it into us. You know, I was born in 1963, so I cannot remember the war, but somehow I am emotional about it. So my parents, my grandparents somehow transmitted it. My children are less so. So maybe the general rule of memory, that as long as you have it in communicative memory, the things you have heard from your grandparents, it's still important. But we'll see. First World War is still important in France, in Great Britain, even in Canada, despite the fact that the last soldiers of the First World War have died some time ago. So I think the Second World War will remain an important topic. And again, do we want to use it for peace or for war? Because we can develop conclusions from the history of the Second World War to work for peace, or we can use them as an argument for conflicts, both international and domestic conflicts. And this is up to us. The past is defenseless, is open to our interpretations.
Велике спасибі. І один із
Thank you very much. And one of the conclusions that we try to make for peace, that the world is trying to make for peace, is the events of the history of the Holocaust in the Second World War, which you've already asked me, which you already referred to in your previous response. We see stories today of many survivors of the Second World War, or even survivors of the Holocaust, who managed to survive then, but are being re-traumatized, re-victimized by Russian aggression today. In another case, Holocaust today is often seen as the paradigmatic genocide that is often compared to acts of Russian violence, both openly and not less openly. It's acts of violence by the Russian army against Ukraine. How legitimate do you think these comparisons are with the Holocaust, or viewing the Holocaust as a paradigmatic genocide?
Well, Holocaust is at the root of the term genocide, because Rafał Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the term, he lost his family in the Holocaust and invented the term genocide to describe this event, which was not unprecedented, but the name comes from his experience. This is one. Second is that I try to avoid the term genocide until really necessary, because it's like the ultimate evil. It's relatively diminishing other crimes against humanity and war crimes. You don't need to commit genocide to do horrible things. Crimes against humanity, war crimes are equally horrible. And there is certain relative devaluation of the understanding how evil other crimes may be. Second, when we speak specifically about the Holocaust, it's setting the bar of evil very high. If you don't have gas chambers, it's okay, right? It's a lesser crime. So I'm for making comparison. I believe much of history is comparative analysis, but comparisons are good to show similarities and differences. So yes, of course, we can compare Holocaust to other genocides. We can compare Holocaust to other crimes against humanity, but to see similarities and differences. And it's not always fortunate exactly because of this radical nature of the Holocaust as total and industrial killing. So, the definition by Lemkin is much broader than the, relatively successful Nazi plan to kill all the Jews of Europe within their reach. So, in the lands of Poland, if we exclude those Polish Jews who survived in the Soviet interior, because they were lucky to be deported in 1940, some 95, maybe 97% perished under German occupation. So that was highly effective in Eastern Europe. And so I warn against this comparison. I'm not against using it, but I say it is risky because if you have other crime, which is equally horrible, it looks lesser just because you don't have a killing rate of 96%. For me, a killing rate of 50% is sufficiently horrible. You don't need to kill almost everyone. So yes, we can talk about it, but sometimes using this comparison is blurring the vision of the present more than shedding light on it.
Thank you. Actually, your country, the country you represent, Poland, at some point in your calculation, you said that Poland has gone through about 11 serious discussions of the Holocaust. Probably since the time that it's been a few years since the time that you named that figure, and probably the number of those discussions may have grown.
Yeah.
How would you say, what are the consequences of these discussions from the point of view of today? What has been the role of the rethinking of the role of the Holocaust and the Second World War? What might be the role of such a discussion in Ukraine in our striving to coming to terms with the past?
So I saw, first time I presented the Polish debates in the late 1990s. And then I thought that we are at the peak of the debates. And a few years later came the biggest debate on the Holocaust in Poland. That was the debate following the publication of the book The Neighbors by Jan Tomasz Gross about the killing of Jews in Jedwabne in today's Eastern Poland. And yes, since this number is bigger than 11, we had at least 2 more major debates, but something has changed with the Polish debates. Something has changed about 2010. Before 2010, these debates were sometimes nasty, they were very heated, emotional at times, and not everyone behaved politely towards opponents. But there was a line of progress. Namely, the debates were an exercise in developing language to talk about a painful past. So we gradually, debate by debate, were developing words, grammar, developing a set of facts known publicly to which we can refer as historians. So there was a cumulative process which was not only good for our understanding of the past of Poland, but for democracy in general. It was an exercise in deliberative democracy, a way of building shared conclusions through controversy. Again, a way of transforming a conflict into a shared conclusion, even if partial. Each debate was bringing us a little bit more to a better understanding of the past and a shared understanding of the past. Not of everybody, but it was a positive cumulative process. And I think it was also a way for us historians to transfer certain principles of academic discussion from academia to the general public. Historians were serving as agents of civility, a civilized way of solving problems between us by referring to the facts, by building on existing knowledge, by treating your opponent with respect. I think it was a great exercise in something very fundamental for democracy, or in more general, for living in peace with your neighbors. And I don't mean only, neighbors as nations, but other people in your society, people who have different opinions about something emotional. So I saw it, despite many problems, I saw it as a great success. This series of debates, which, by the way, started already under the communist regime. And I think that was the difference between Poland and other communist countries. That in Poland, the debates about the Holocaust started well before the end of the Holocaust. before of, specific aspects of history of communist Poland, like the Solidarity movement, the crisis of the communist regime in the 1980s, and so on. But in the last 10 years, something happened which made these debates counterproductive. They don't lead to a shared conclusion, they lead to a polarization, and they are used to polarize. Some people deliberately incite from time to time a controversy on Polish Jewish past to incite emotions and polarize the public. And again, I have not systematically analyzed it, but I have a strong feeling that this is related to a technological change. Namely, up to early 2000s, public debates were made in the printed press, television, and radio. In the last decade, public debate is a debate online. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, mainly. And the logic of this media is different than the logic of the printed press. And there is scholarship about it. There is a research about the logic of printed media and the logic of the social media. And I am afraid that social media, and specifically the algorithms of the social media, which favor controversy, which help spread fake news, which help spread biased information and emotional information, they work to the detriment of the debates as we need it. So I'm afraid that without changing the algorithms of the social media, imposing some rules on them, we are a little bit like European nations were in the early 20th century, before the First World War, when the new cheap press, the yellow press, was inciting chauvinism, xenophobia, hatred between neighbors. So the technological revolution of the late 19th century had a cost like the First World War. And I'm afraid that the technological revolution, the revolution in the communication technology of the last 10 to 15 years has also a cost. And if we don't do something, when I say we, human beings, and specifically Americans, because the algorithms are decided by the nice people in Palo Alto, California. So if they don't change something, we may pay a significant cost for these new technologies of communication.
Велике дякую за такий вихід.
Thank you very much for this switch to modern technology and the role in the discussion. To come back or to continue with the subject of the Holocaust, we do understand that the history of the Holocaust is not just a history of particular nations or countries, the continental catastrophe, including the Ukrainian and the Ukrainian-Polish relations. This is something that is a reference point. It is often studied, the history of the Holocaust, the Polish Jews or the Ukrainian Jews, different things are said, but these were usually Jews that lived in the territory of Poland. It's difficult for us to separate one history and see its protagonists as members of the history of Poland and the history of Ukraine. What do you think are the main points of contact of this history in Ukraine and Poland?
Well, a few years ago, when I worked at the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, I had a delegation of Ukrainian historians from the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance from Kyiv. So I guided them through the exhibition, and it took us, I think, more than 2 hours. And at the end of it, one of them said something which I think was really crucial, important. He said, "Oh, now I realize that the Jewish history is the shared part of the Polish and Ukrainian history. Because when we speak about Polish Jews, many of them were Ukrainian Jews, territorially. So this is a shared section of our past, and the problems that started with the emergence of the modern nationalism in late 19th century in this part of Europe. The great transformation which Tim Snyder has presented in his book about the reconstruction of nations. I think that we are still in this period and looking for ways to take the potential of conflict out of it, to translate it into a peaceful interpretation. And I think the making it into a triangle rather than bipolar situation of Polish-Ukrainian past, making it into a Polish-Jewish-Ukrainian past may help us. It offers us a third point of view on the story. So my selling point for the museum was that because we don't have yet the Museum of the History of Poland, Polin Museum, which shows the history of Poland, is such a museum, but it's a very particular way of showing Polish history, namely from a minority perspective, not from the perspective of the dominant group of Polish-speaking Roman Catholics, but from a minority perspective. And from a minority perspective, you see things differently. So maybe looking at Ukrainian history, at Polish-Ukrainian relations from a perspective of a third minority, for example, it's very useful to understand the Polish-Ukrainian war for Lvov-Lviv in 1918-1919. And the Jews of Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, who were trapped into this battle, trying to avoid taking sides and eventually being punished for what they did and did not. So it offers us a chance to understand better and provide a more nuanced vision of the past, because bipolarity is not helpful. It's good to radicalize, sometimes it's good to clarify the way of thinking, but it's not good in providing the nuance. And the triangle, and then we can add, actually expand this exercise in finding other perspectives, because there are other groups that do not fit. For me, the most radical exercise is to try to look at these histories from a Roma, a gypsy perspective, a group without ambitions to have a state completely and dispersed among others, and also affected by the Nazi genocidal policies, which is marginalized to the present. So for me, this is the radical, radical perspective. But for the time being, the Jewish history is also useful for history of Poland and history of Ukraine for two reasons. First, you cannot understand history of Poland, and I think you cannot understand history of Ukraine without the Jews. If you present history of Poland or Ukraine and you don't mention the Jews, it cannot be true. Well, maybe for early Middle Ages, okay? But afterwards, doesn't work. Of course, it works also the other way. You cannot understand the history of Jews in Europe without mentioning Poland and Ukraine. And second argument is that Jewish history is a well-developed history. There is a lot of high-quality scholarship. So it's good to use it. I think it's good to think with the Jews about some topic. And I say it as a non-Jewish Pole. To my knowledge, I don't have any Jewish origin. My grandparents were simple peasants. So I have came to the topic of Polish Jewish history as an outsider looking at it. And I found plenty of benefits in first integrating Jewish history into the modern nation's past, not excluding it. And second, looking from another perspective at the standard visions of the past, which are in the 20th century were, as a rule, nationalist, and in this way, narrow.
Thank you very much. A very profound answer. And my next question then has to do with a life situation that I've found myself in a few years ago in presenting a quick documentary video for the students of a school in Rivne. And I was asked after showing this video that the video showed the area of the ghetto, of the Rivne ghetto, the place where the ghetto was located. And some of the students asked me, well, how is it possible? Was there really a ghetto here? I mean, we live in those buildings. We live in those buildings that were in the territory of the ghetto. These are old buildings that existed from the late 19th, early 20th century. And one of the key problems of the Holocaust that you have written and spoken about is the question of the robbery of the victims of the Holocaust and the restitution. It's a question of the transfer of property from the social point of view, from the Jews to the Ukrainians or to the Poles. In your case, you have studied these processes in the territory of Poland. Now, why is the question of the restitution of Jewish property in Ukraine and Poland? Why are they linked? Or how are they linked?
Well, they are connected by two facts of history undeniable. One is a high concentration of Jewish presence in exactly in Eastern Europe, in what was the eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then was the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, or Galicia in the Habsburg Empire. So much higher, much more visible and stronger presence of the Jews than in any West European country. And second, when you combine it with the almost complete destruction under the German occupation, these two facts make it an important event. That means the people were killed, but not all of their property was destroyed. A large part of the property was taken immediately by the German state, and we know it, but still enough remained on the ground to become the spoils of others. And I remember, many conversations when I was doing my field research on various topics. The best job I ever had was making photographs for the Ministry of Culture many years ago and riding my bicycle from village to village in Poland. That the topic of Jewish property was coming again and again. That people were asking, so aren't you working for the Jews? Do the Jews plan to take it back from us? And it was 50 years after the war, 60 years after the war. So there was certain insecurity. And by the way, there is a new book by our younger Israeli colleague, Dr. Weizmann, about this topic, about the Jewish, the relics of the Jewish communal property, the synagogues and the cemeteries in communist Poland, where he shows that the topic was coming again and again. And one of the ways of working with it is to try to forget, to suppress this knowledge. So again, I also know young people in Poland who are very much surprised. So there was a ghetto in our town? Really? Jews made 50% of the population of the town? I have never heard about it. By the way, one of the most beautiful examples is an example of a Polish sportsman, an Olympic kayak swimmer from a small town in southern Poland, who one day realized that a major part of his town population was Jewish and that they were killed exactly where he was training every day, by the banks of the river. And he began a local project to commemorate them. And they recently unveiled a beautiful monument in the town. So you may realizing what was the past is the first step to do it. And I think it's very similar, actually, what's the difference of finding it out in Krościenko, the small town I'm speaking now about, and in Drohobycz in Western Ukraine? There is no difference. There is no difference. There was a difference in the nature of the communist regime. In communist Poland, the memory of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, was less suppressed than in the Soviet Union. It existed in literature, in the monuments very often. These were not monuments to the peaceful civilians, peaceful Soviet civilians, but they were specifically mentioning the Jews. So I think that there is a past, but the past is in the post-war period. Second, there is, of course, a difference between the Polish nationalist underground movement and the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Because a part of the Ukrainian nationalist movement believed that Germany may help establish independent Ukraine. And I think this is the major difference. It's in the decisions of the elite, not of ordinary people. I don't think that Ukrainian peasants were more anti-Semitic than Polish peasants. or Lithuanian peasants were more anti-Semitic than Polish peasants. I don't know how to measure it, but I think the degree of the prejudice, religious prejudice, ethnic prejudice was quite similar. And these were different decisions of the political elites that led to different outcomes. And again, I see it as an opportunity to think about Polish nationalism, to think about Ukrainian nationalism, to think about Lithuanian nationalism, and about contemporary memory policies. What does it tell about us today, the way we treat the past? I am not responsible for the Second World War, and no one of us here in this seminar. All of us were born after the war. But we are responsible for what we do with this past today. This is our responsibility for the past, not for the acts that were committed between 1939 and 1945, but for the acts we commit today, how we talk about it, what do we support, what do we deny, what do we neglect. This is our historical responsibility.
Дякую дуже. І в продовження цієї непростої теми української.
Thank you very much. And to continue this difficult question of Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish relations and in the Holocaust, many historians, including Jan Gross, Omer Bartov, they write of the gain of the benefit that that Ukrainians and Poles received from the freeing of the social niches by the Jews as a result of the Holocaust. So both property and the clearing of social niche. But I think we talk less about, it seems that we talk less about those social economic losses that Ukrainians and Poles got from the disappearance of the Jews. What were they? Has anybody calculated how many Ukrainians or Poles died in the first post-war years or got some incurable diseases because of the, for instance, disappearance of Jewish doctors when nobody could provide this help? This is a problem that we can often see at the level of archival documents, the lack of artisans, the lack of doctors, etc.
Well, I think that, yes, of course, there were some people gained individually and in a way that we can measure houses, although the measure we have today is different to the measure of the time back in the past. A pair of shoes was sometimes a sufficient reason to kill someone because a pair of shoes was something highly valuable. But going back to your question, is that many people do not distinguish between property and economy. When you run a business, it's not enough to have assets. The question is to how to make them productive. And this is the stream of economic benefits. The economy is the stream of economic benefits. You may take over, let's say, a shoemaker shop, but if you are not a shoemaker, it doesn't have any use for you. You can sell it. So I think that one of the major mistakes about the economic consequences of the Holocaust is that the general chaos of war, the fact that the war has almost completely destroyed the local economies, make the losses resulting from the disappearance of Jews invisible. Because I don't agree with the anti-Semites, Polish anti-Semites before the war, who were saying that the Jews were parasites. They were not. They were contributing to the national economy, and probably they were contributing more than 10% of the GDP. Jews made 10% of the population of pre-war Poland, because they were urban population, they were more educated population, so they were working in the sectors of the economy where people were more productive than in the agriculture. So I suppose that the Jewish contribution to the economy was bigger than 10%, and actually the contribution to the taxes was certainly bigger than 10%, this we know. So the disappearance was a loss. But this is an immaterial loss. This is a loss in the stream of services, of ideas, of new enterprises, new businesses, which is difficult to distinguish, especially, as I said, in the general catastrophe of war. We cannot measure it. So we can see that someone took over a house which was a Jewish property, but we cannot see that, as you said, you know, I just read an article, a dissertation about Jewish doctors in interwar Poland. And there was a beautiful quotation from a Polish Medical Association bulletin saying, oh, the medical profession in the Lwów voivodeship is completely Judaized. Jews made 60% of the doctors in this province. It's horrible. We can do something about it. So if you have a region where 60% of the doctors are Jewish and almost all of them are killed, this is a loss. Nobody profits from it. Nobody. So yes, some people gained, but as societies, we lost. And there was a dramatic loss, which is a long-term loss. Again, it's hidden, for example, in Poland, it's hidden in a general destruction of the educated elite, which was the target of both the Nazi and the Soviet terror. But for example, again, almost half of Polish lawyers was Jewish. And a significant part of the entrepreneurial class was Jewish. Significant part of the creative class of writers, painters, actors, singers, composers was Jewish. So these are the losses which are difficult to quantify, but I believe we need to take them into account to realize that the limited personal gain of some people came with a general national loss.
Thank you very much. And I would like to switch to the present day affairs and the studies of the Holocaust in Ukraine. So my final question will have to do with how the Holocaust studies in Ukraine and Poland, and also in the neighboring Russia and Belarus occur. Part of Ukrainian scholars today stress that Ukraine has much better conditions for Holocaust scholarship than, for instance, Russia or Belarus, where Holocaust studies either are not institutionalized at all or are under permanent political pressure from the regime, where history continues to remain within the framework of propaganda and played a similar function to what it did in the Soviet time. How do you see the state and the prospects of the Ukrainian Holocaust studies, perhaps as compared to Poland, which has done a lot more, at least so it seems in the past? At least in the past, that's what the situation looked like.
So first, I have already mentioned it that communist Poland was relatively good for Holocaust studies comparing to other communist countries. That means there existed, the little ghetto of the Jewish Historical Institute, which up to 1960s made significant contribution to Holocaust studies. Some very early Holocaust monographies, before the term Holocaust was applied to the Churban or the Shoah or Zagłada. I prefer to use the Polish term Zagłada rather than the Greek word Holocaust. So first, there was significant scholarship already in communist Poland. Of course, it had a bias, this Marxist-Leninist bias of imposing the perspective of the class struggle on it, but still a lot was done at that time. Second, the debates, the public debates, they contributed that they were using the historiography, but they were also contributing to the historiography because they were arousing public interest in the topic. Public wanted to know from historians, so what happened? Tell us. And historians were coming with better or worse answers, which made young people coming to the Holocaust studies. So there were people coming and saying, I want to write a dissertation on the Holocaust. And now we have a whole generation of young scholars who are really excellent, who speak languages. They know at least one Jewish language. They can easily read sources in Yiddish, in Polish, in German. And, when I decided to write my dissertation back in 1988 about Holocaust history, I didn't know anybody else working on the topic. I felt rather lonely in choosing this topic. Now you have conferences, people disagree, and the disagreement among historians is good because we can clarify our position. So I would say Poland had some, well, we had some good luck. I'm not an expert in Ukrainian Holocaust research, but I know that there are two countries in Europe that didn't have large debates about the Holocaust, and this is Belarus and Russia. There were debates in Norway, Sweden, Poland, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece, Spain, Great Britain, Baltic states, and Ukraine, but not in these two countries. It doesn't mean that the past was different. It means that the present is different. And this is dictatorship, simply. So, for example, I have been to the founding moment of the Babin Yar museum, and I know there are many controversies in Ukraine about it. People disagree on this topic, but I think it's okay that you disagree because you talk about it. And when you talk about it, people must provide arguments. When they need arguments, they start making research. So as long as there is an open debate, and this debate is not nasty that you intimidate your opponent or you call him a traitor all the time, it's productive, even if the progress is slow. Another aspect of the Holocaust history is that this is a very international history. That you have American historians, you have Israeli historians, you have German historians and others who work on the topic, and you have mentioned Omer Bartow and Jan Gross. You know, Jan Gross is an exilee, a Polish scholar, but he has spent most of his scholarly life in the United States, so he is Polish and American and Jewish at the same time. So we can benefit from the fact of this internationalization of the Holocaust scholarship, both in Poland and in Ukraine. That means it improves the quality, the language, the dictionary we use for this scholarship is very advanced. I think that in Poland, Holocaust research is the most advanced part of the 20th century history, intellectually. You know, it's only 6 years, and it's only 10% of the population, but still because of this internationalization, it was helpful. You know, the fact that you can relatively easily get a research grant, it also helps. What doesn't help is that when you have political controversies, as we now have in Poland, you have the chilling effect. That means if you can be accused in the public media that you're a traitor, and what you write is against the interest of the Polish nation, some young people may think twice before taking to this topic. But this is a separate story. It's not only in Poland, not only in Eastern Europe. It happens in various countries, but in Poland, it is Poland and Hungary. It's especially visible. And finally, I think that Ukrainian historians can benefit from just meeting and talking with Polish historians, because we have a lot of expertise, you know, experience, which is good and bad, and it's good to use someone else's mistakes rather than making your own mistakes.
Thank you, Professor Stola, Professor Dariusz Stola. Again, I would like to thank him for joining our seminar, and I would like to remind everyone, the listeners of our seminar today, that you can put your questions in the chat, and we do have a few questions in the chat to Professor Stola. I will voice them to the extent on a first-come, first-served basis, and I will read them probably in the original language as they were written down, to avoid misunderstanding.
We have a question from Professor Yaroslav Krycak to Professor Stola. Question is, do you think that the current war may change our perception of the World War II in general and the Holocaust particularly? If yes, then in what ways?
First, I'm pretty sure that the war will contribute to the continuing interest in Holocaust in Eastern Europe. It has shifted already several years ago, you know, with the Father Patrick Debois, the Holocaust by ballot, and the accessibility of East European archives. So the focus previously was on the German war killing machine and the German administration and Auschwitz, and then it gradually expanded into Eastern Europe on the Einsatzgruppen and mass shooting and the local participation in killing. So again, Jan Tomasz Gross made a significant contribution, and the follow-up to his book on the local Polish collaboration on the Holocaust. Omer Bartow did something similar for Western Ukraine. So I think it will strengthen this understanding. It will also give a new energy into what Tim Snyder presented as the Bloodlands, as the place of the concentration of violence. And I think we may follow, especially when it combines with some other tendencies in historiography. And my favorite one is the spatial turn, the idea of thinking about the past in terms of space, of physical proximity. I think it's very useful. And we are now applying with a group of my friends here in Warsaw for a research grant exactly about the mobility under German occupation and the space as a crucial category of analysis. For example, I would think about the ecosystems of violence, how different forms of violence are contagious, how the killing of Jews contributed to the escalation of the Ukrainian-Polish conflict, for example, how the presence of arms and general demoralization contributes to it. So I think some tendencies that have been visible already in the past will be strengthened. Second, we may expect the marginalization of the Russian historiography, simply, especially of those historians who proved to be not to be trustworthy, who were too quick to support the war and support the Russian regime. Simply you realize they are not reliable. And that now you will think twice, you will check twice every argument they provide, because if they lie now, maybe they have lied in the past as well. This doesn't apply to the Russian scholars only, or some of the Russian scholars, those who supported the war. You know, I don't expect ordinary Russians to be heroic and go to the streets and oppose it, but we may expect them not to openly support the war. This is my experience from the communist period. Usually people who are supporting it did it on their own will and not under heavy pressure. And so I expect a long-term decline of interest in Russian historiography, which will affect various aspects of history, not only Second World War and the Holocaust. Second, another tendency which will be strengthened is this combination of very imperial war, of a late imperial war of the Russian invasion, and the very powerful stream of thinking in terms of colonial terms. However, in this colonial or decolonial theories, which I'm sometimes critical of it, there has been a gap about the Second World. It's been very much about the former European or North American white settler states, imperial states, and the global South. And the former communist world was somehow missing from the story. To what extent we can apply the colonial theory? How does it work? Was Poland a colonial state in Ukraine or it wasn't? And so on. So I think we can see a renewal of this way of thinking, because there is certain urgency, how to understand it. And I think maybe not the colonial perspective, but the imperial perspective is very much applicable. Myself a few years ago wrote that, for example, the Soviet-German agreement from 1939, the partition of Eastern Europe, of Poland, the Baltic states and Romania, was empires striking back, both the Russian and the German Empire striking back at the new nation states that emerged in Eastern Europe. And finally, we can expect consequences of the limited access to the archives. This has been a major difference between Russia, Belarus, and other former countries of the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states and Ukraine. Accessibility of documents was much bigger in these countries. You know, it's not accidental that you have substantial scholarship, for example, on the Holocaust in Ukraine, and much less on the Holocaust in Belarus or Russia. Sources is the basis of our work. And I don't expect Russian archives to be accessible in any near future.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Stola.
Дуже дякую, професор Стола. І ще одне запитання від Валерії Капран. Запитання на продовження питання пана Грицака. Як війна Росії проти війни може вплинути на юридичні визначення того, що таке Голокост? Наприклад, як Європейський парламент звертатися до пам'яті Голокосту після російського вторгнення?
Well, to my knowledge, there are no legal definition of the Holocaust. The legal definition of the genocide, and this is the Genocide Convention, with the definition coined by Raphael Lemkin and amended to have the Soviet support, by the way. He excluded some kinds of crimes exactly to have the Soviet Union supported. But I don't expect that the understanding of the Holocaust would change. We don't have definitions of the Holocaust, but we have definitions of anti-Semitism, not legal, but international. One is the so-called Stockholm definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which I don't like, but it has one positive feature. It has been adopted by several states. So we have a definition of anti-Semitism which is accepted by the governments, which is good, for example, in fighting anti-Semitism. And there is the Jerusalem definition, which is better than the Stockholm definition. It's more analytical, I would say, but again, I would rather think about developing our own definitions, East European definitions. How do we, in Poland and Ukraine, how do we see anti-Semitism? What do we believe to be crucial in the Holocaust? So, for example, for my understanding of the Holocaust, and my conclusion of the debate about Jedwabne killing and Jan Tomasz Gross' book about Jedwabne was that you have this crucial moment sometime in July 1941, when mass killing of the Jews becomes the total killing of the Jews, killing of each and every Jew. Because even after the attack of 22nd June 1941, initially, German troops, Einsatzgruppen, were killing initially only male Jews, not women and children. And after a few weeks, they started killing all the Jews. And to this moment, it's not fully clear how did it happen. There is some scholarship on the topic. So, for example, for me, the Jedwabne debate in Poland was interesting for many reasons, but one reason was it's one of the earliest cases of the intention to kill all the Jews. So I cannot exclude that this shift from mass terror to total terror, and I think the essence of the Holocaust is in the total ambition to kill all the Jews. There were many pogroms in Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th century. There were hundreds of pogroms in Ukraine during the civil war and revolution, but none of them, to my knowledge, was to completely exterminate the Jews. So I think this is the radical novelty of the summer of 1941, and we need to find out where did it came from. So, you know, once I had an idea that that was a misunderstanding between German officers and local collaborators, that local collaborators misunderstood the German order. German officer wanted to kill male Jews, and local collaborator understood, oh, they tell us to kill all the Jews. I don't know, but I think it's a good case to show the need for our own understandings. because maybe we can provide something to the international debate on the Holocaust, to global scholarship of the Holocaust, with something which the Americans, Israelis, or West Europeans have not seen yet.
У нас формується певна тенденція, коли
We seem to have a tendency forming when the listeners of our seminar formulate questions in English, but from abroad we have questions in Ukrainian. Next question is from Ms. Alexandra Rublevska. The current war brings forth in the Ukrainian society the need to be different from Russians in every possible field, including in the sphere of the joint past and the role in the Second World War. How do you, what do you think about the spontaneous transformation of the places of memory that have to do with the Soviet army that is happening in Ukraine today?
I have my problem with the Soviet monuments in Poland. And I'm not happy with what has been done with the Soviets monument in Poland, because I believe that, you know, several 100,000 Soviet soldiers, including Ukrainian and Georgian and Azerbaijani and others, all of, you know, young men who are dying in the actually last days of war. I just have been this summer in Lower Silesia at one of the cemeteries, you know, boys 18 years old who were killed in late April 1945. So I think we here in Poland, we should think more about how to commemorate these young people who died to defeat Nazi Germany. I don't think it was their intention to expand communist dictatorship into Poland. But this debate has not been completed in Poland. We have not yet developed a proper balance between what was liberation from the German occupation and introduction of the communist dictatorship. So this is interesting, that most of the Soviet monuments were removed. Cemeteries remain because they are protected under international law. But it hasn't been a topic of a major public debate, and I miss it, because I believe we should put more efforts. I understand that in Ukraine it's much more difficult because the stakes are higher. First, that many of the Soviet soldiers were Ukrainians. Second is that you now have a Russian invasion. So on both ends of the scale, you have much heavier arguments for protecting them or changing them or removing them. My general principle in dealing with the relics of the past is, if you don't need to destroy something, don't destroy it. It's better to remove it to a museum. It's better to put a new interpretation and information. I remember in Italy, in northern Italy, I saw a monument, a fascist monument, which the fascists erected for themselves, which was not destroyed, but there was a plaque added explaining the meaning of it. So it served a double role. It was not to forget about the fascist rule, it was to remind about the fascist rule. I remember seeing, when I was riding my bicycle from Ternopil to Kolomyia in Western Ukraine a few years ago with my children, I remember finding one of these war memorials, "Никто не забыт, ничего не забыто." And later on, I learned who invented these words and what a dramatic story of forgetting is hidden behind it. So I think the showing the hypocrisy of the communist memory policies is also something important. I don't think there is a general answer for all post-communist states, you know, one policy that we can apply. I think that every country, maybe every region, should have its own answers. But what I believe to be applicable everywhere is that central governments should not force people locally into a way of remembering the past. Local communicative memory, the way how people tell the stories to their children and grandchildren and their neighbors, is valuable. Even if we disagree, it's better to engage into a discussion with them rather than impose from, like at present in Poland. We have the government in Warsaw telling people in small towns how they should remember their own past. I don't think it's a good way of acting. But you'll have to invent your own ways in Ukraine, depending on these particular conditions and this much heavier stakes than in Poland on both ends of the scale.
Thank you so much, Professor Stola. Yeah, this way to destroy something, the easiest way, but it often doesn't relate it to rethinking the past. And the next one question from Professor Yaroslav Rycak. In returning to the discussion concerning the concept, the notion of genocide, Dariusz, do you think that the concept of genocide should be rethought to return to the original formulation of Lemkin? Or probably historians should use the concept of genocide differently, more broadly, than it is used in nowadays international law?
As I said, I have a problem with the word genocide. I greatly appreciate what Rafał Lemkin did, but in this big debate between Lemkin and his colleague from the University of Lvov, Lauterpracht, who was a big supporter of the idea of crimes against humanity, against individuals, not groups. This essential division, I think, because Lemkin's idea assumes that there are peoples. And the question comes, of their definition and the boundaries and so on, while the rest of the law, Western law, is based on certain rights of individuals. So I have a problem, especially as the term genocide became a kind of stick to be added to all kinds of crimes. In Poland, we had this ongoing debate, should we call the mass killing of Poles in Volhynia in 1943-44 a genocide or not? And after a while, it became counterproductive. It was not to offer us a better understanding. It was to be just, it was to be emphatic in accusation. So I don't use the word genocide very often. I would rather think, okay, if we have a kind of a crime with which we have a problem, maybe instead of exchanging the Lemkin's definition, which we should invent a new word. Now, if he was able to invent something in 1945-46, maybe we can invent something new at present. Returning to the original definition would add this class dimension. And to my knowledge, there is the problem with the class at present in the contemporary wars. It's when you have systematic policies of killing, of extermination, it applies to elite, yes, broadly speaking, but it applies to elite of ethnic groups or nations. So it somehow is within the limits of the Lemkin definition. And finally, I would again stress that the crimes against humanity and war crimes are as horrible as genocide. They are not lesser crimes, and they are punishable. We should punish the perpetrators of the crimes against humanity and the war crimes, and maybe exactly refocus from the word genocide onto the crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity, they have also one aspect worth noting, namely they show that the victims are members of the shared humanity. Genocide divides the victims into Jews, Armenians, Ukrainians, separates them from other human beings. Crime against humanity is a crime against every human being, not only the direct victim of it. So it may be building broader solidarities with the victims than the idea of the genocide. But these are my very personal opinions, which result from the Polish discussions and the Polish abuse of the term genocide. Maybe somewhere else it's used in a more restrained way, but I'm afraid you can very easily make it so flexible that it doesn't mean anything anymore.
Велике дякую. І на сам кінець.
Thank you very much. And finally, perhaps a final reflection, question, comment. Simeon Golden asked to give a final reflection. Our partner, please, the floor is yours. Thank Petro.
З Жидовським Новим роком. I have two
Hello, welcome, and
comments about the overcoming the past. I think in place that the present and future is very problematic and unclear, past should be overcome. No, even not speaking about Poland or Ukraine, just look at Russia. It's like kind of bloody Groundhog Day. Yeah, every time it's again and again oppression, totalitarianism, etc. So something should be done with the past, probably. I don't know about any Danish debate about overcoming the past. Maybe in Denmark it's enough to be in terms of this past, but we are very, very, as you said, the spatial connection is very important here. The second comment is about using the historical memory by populists. I think it's very much, every time populism is about mastering the resentment and excluding, yeah, it's выключение. So when and where it comes with historical clauses of historical wounded or traumas, etc., like in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, it comes with historical memory. For example, in Israel, we have our rightist populists that are not so much using all this narrative, because it's very much consensus of historical memory of nation that they don't need to use it in political terms. And my question is about the next day. You said amazing, very, very, very thought-provoking things about the impact on research, impact on historical memory of current events, current barbarian war against Ukraine. So my question is, do you think maybe it at some place remove the very uncomfortable question for some East Europeans, I mean Ukrainians, Poles, and maybe Lithuanians, Latvians, about participation, about the events of World War II, about the Holocaust, participation in Zagłada, not participation in Zagłada, etc. Because now the situation changed dramatically. We East Europeans are in new fight against new fascism. We are on the front line against new genocide. So all this old question about where you did when Jews were killed is much more, maybe much less relevant today. What do you think?
Well, first, I'm glad to see you, Semyon, again at a seminar run from Kyiv. Respectfully, I will disagree with this overcoming. To make it more, nuanced answer, you can overcome a part of the past only using another part of the past. You should not deprive the Russians from all the history, saying this history was bad, just get rid of it. No, find something in your past which can help you overcome the other part of it. Okay, really, we don't have much. All our material possessions may be gone in a few days. But the idea that we share a past is something very valuable, and I will not reject it. I am for reinterpreting it, not rejecting it. So I suppose as long as the Russians don't find in their past something with which they can build peaceful relations with their neighbors, a free society, free of oppression, and the readiness to talk about this past, it will be very difficult. So I would rather support them in the efforts of finding something other than, authoritarian regimes and terror in the past. Second, yes, I agree. I already see it, for example, the criticism in the European Union against the undermining of the rule of law in Poland by the Polish government. Since Poland was so helpful for Ukraine in taking Ukrainian refugees, our government receives less criticism than it was receiving some time ago. But let me reframe it. Yes, Ukraine is now at the front line, and Poland and Baltic states are helping Ukrainians fight this war for all of us. But the question is, like the old, I'm not sure this is true, but if this is not true, it's very well invented. The story about Winston Churchill and cutting the budget for culture in Great Britain during the Second World War. He was told that we must cut the budget for culture because all the money should go for the war effort. And then he asked, so why are we fighting this war for? We are fighting this war exactly, among others, so we can freely discuss difficult past. This is what makes us different to Russia today. They cannot discuss the Holocaust in Russia. We can make it. And one of the reasons I don't want to live in Russia is I want to have these discussions. I like them. I believe they are good for my country. So I am pretty sure some people in Poland and in Lithuania and in Ukraine will use this argument to close the discussion. But I will oppose them. I will say, yes, of course, at present in Ukraine, you have other priorities than doing this. But as soon as you can, you should return to them. And in Poland, we have no reason to stop the discussions. We are not in war. We can continue. Moreover, we see how important the distortion of the past is, that is exactly used for much worse policies than just the image of the past. So I have the Russian policy and the Russian propaganda provides very strong arguments to continue talking about the difficult past rather than to discontinue these discussions.
Дякую. Дякую.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stola, for this answer, and for the continuation of this discussion is continuing. The work of the Overcoming the Past section, which was usually focused on the study of the Holocaust in Ukraine, the questions of its social dynamics, of participation in the Holocaust. We continue to do this in the format of seminars. Today's seminar is wrapping up. Our time is running out. I would like to thank everyone again for their questions, for their participation in this seminar, and to also remind them that this is being recorded in two versions, Ukrainian and English. Both versions will be posted on the official YouTube channel of Ukraina Moderna. This will happen in time, probably over the next week. And over the next few days, we will announce our next seminar, which will continue the discussions on Russia's modern current war against Ukraine, the Second World War and its role in the discourse, and on the history of the Holocaust. This is the focus of our seminars. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for their attention. I wish everyone victory, peace, and freedom and democracy, and the opportunity to freely study and discuss any historical questions that matter today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.